Pepperdine School of Public Policy. I'm Pete Peterson, the very grateful Dean of this graduate policy program, welcoming you here to the next in our Live from Malibu April short course series. This session with Dr. Robert Kaufman, our Dockson Professor of Public Policy, is titled Trump's Principled Realism and the Major Themes in U.S. Foreign Policy. I know that some of you joined us last time, but for those of you who this is your first time with us, we are using the Zoom online platform to offer this class. And if you haven't used Zoom before, it actually is a pretty easy online platform to use. We ask that all of you mute your microphones and cameras, which you'll find those switches, so to speak, or links down in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. The format for these classes is that we begin with about 45 minutes of lecture on the content and then move into Q&A with you all in the last 15 minutes. Due to the size of our class, we are utilizing the chat feature for you to offer your questions. That chat button you'll also see in the bottom of your screen. By clicking on that and typing in your question, I'll be moderating those questions when we head into the last 15 minutes of the class. You should feel free throughout the session to type your questions if you have particular items you'd like to raise, but again, I'll be getting to those in the last 15 minutes of the class. This again is one of a series of courses that we're offering through Pepperdine. As I mentioned, Dr. Kaufman is one of our faculty here at the Policy School. You see his background here. Dr. Kaufman got his PhD from Columbia University and is the holder of at least 6 different degrees. He is an expert in American foreign policy, national security, international relations, and various aspects of American politics. Dr. Kaufman writes widely in opinion pieces, both online and in print. He is the author of several books, particularly on foreign policy. The most recent being Dangerous Doctrine, How Obama's Grand Strategy Weakened America in 2016. And prior to that, In Defense of the Bush Doctrine, a biography. Bob has also written Henry M. Jackson, A Life in Politics. This particular series for Dr. Kaufman is being derived from some research he's doing for a forthcoming book. This will be, as you can note, the third in a trilogy of books about presidential foreign policy strategies. The title of this book, forthcoming, Bob, is
Better Than It Sounds, President Trump's Grand Strategy and the Restoration of American Sovereignty.
And so that book is forthcoming and obviously related to the subject matter for today's class. I'll just close my introduction by saying that each one of these sessions is being recorded. And for everyone who has registered for this class, whether you're able to join us live or not, you'll be receiving within 24 hours a link to the video for this session, as well as some links for some of the books, if not articles, that Dr. Kaufman will be citing in this lecture. So without any further ado, I welcome you into LC 155 here at Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy with Dr. Kaufman. And Dr. Kaufman, please take it away.
Dean Peterson, thanks for the kind introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Today, I'm going to focus on President Trump's approach to Europe and why he has tried to renegotiate and how he's tried to renegotiate the terms of engagement. Before I do that, I think it's useful for all of you for me to review certain points I made last time to put my analysis and remarks in context. Last time, first in the series of these lectures, I discussed how President Trump's approach to national security fell somewhere in the middle of the spectrum between his propensity to see the world transactionally and the emergence of a full-fledged crystallized doctrine. I emphasized that his approach synthesized an amalgam of principles, all of which had a long pedigree in American foreign relations, without his approach being beholden to any single paradigm. I emphasized that despite all their differences, which dwarf this similarity, President Obama and President Trump both came to office intent on renegotiating the terms of America's engagement with the world. I also posited several principles that have informed President Trump's grand strategy in general and toward Europe in particular. One, President Trump, and this is a very traditional emphasis that is much different than Obama's, emphasizes the idea of geopolitics as a way of ordering American priorities. For every nation, even a nation as wealthy as ours, resources are finite. What geopolitics does, it's a way of looking at the world systematized in the early 20th century by Halford Mackinder. There's a version by Nicholas Speakman. The British practiced geopolitics even by instinct, even before the doctrine became systematized. Geopolitics is a way of assessing which regions are more important than others for the purpose of American national security. And since our founding, this is not new, the United States has believed, with probably the exception of the Obama administration and perhaps the early years of Carter, that America's vital interest, defined as our physical security, our economic vitality, and the vitality of the American way of life, would be in severe peril if a single hostile power were to dominate the major power centers of the world. Between 1500 and 2000, Europe constituted that major power center. The founders believed that were a single hostile power to dominate Europe, that entity would have at its disposal resources to overwhelm us, even including the entire Western Hemisphere, eventually on land and at sea. Now, early on in the 19th century, we didn't have to worry about maintaining the balance of power in the first half because we didn't have the power to do it. And for the remainder of the 19th century, we got our security free. We relied on the British to maintain the balance of power in Europe. 20th century proved that that was no longer possible. Not the only reason, but one of the reasons we went into World War I was to prevent Germany from dominating Europe. One of the reasons we went into World War II, it's not the only reason, but a major reason is to prevent Nazi Germany from dominating Europe. One of the major things that impelled our response to the Soviet threat after World War II was to prevent the Soviet Union from dominating Eurasia. So we've had a vital interest in doing that, literally from the founding. And as I explained last time, that Eurocentric focus, while still important, is no longer the primary power center of the world. What Europe was to world politics between 1500 and 2000, the Indo-Pacific is now. The Indo-Pacific contains over half of the world's population, close to 4 million by 2025. Most of the world's manufacture, at least over 50%, will come from the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific is the fastest growing of the region of the world economically, politically, and militarily. So we're a single hostile power to dominate that region. That would constitute literally the same type of danger to us that Nazi or Soviet dominance would have constituted in the 20th century. This is why I explained last time, President Trump has been prophetic in identifying China's aspirations to dominate the Indo-Pacific as the prime threat for American foreign policy in the 21st century that the United States needs to address vigilantly. I emphasized last time that this threat was multifaceted, economic, political, military, that would require the United States to be vigilant across the board, not just militarily, although militarily, but also to provide the United States with the infrastructure and the productive capabilities so that we would not be economically beholden on an entity that defines us as the main obstacle of their desire to dominate first the Indo-Pacific and eventually the world. And I explained why President Trump's grand strategy and what he's done economically, politically, and militarily has been a major step in the right direction, disabusing us of 30 years of illusions that China was becoming much like us. It's not, he understands it. Today I'm going to move to what used to be the #1 region in the world in terms of power potential and in terms of our attention, Europe. East Asia, the Indo-Pacific, has superseded Europe, but Europe is still important. We have a vital interest in preventing a single hostile power from dominating Europe for reasons of power potential, for reasons of economics, and for regions of ideology. Western Europe is, despite the difficulties we have with it, an area of shared values and fellow democracies. So we still have a vital interest in preventing a single hostile power from dominating Europe, even though that is important but secondary to the Indo-Pacific. And President Trump understands that. We go back to the foundational document of the Trump administration, by my reckoning, Secretary of Defense James Mattis's distillation of the National Security Strategy published in January of 2018, he identifies Russia as the primary threat to America's moral, practical, economic, and geopolitical interests. To some listeners, particularly critical ones, this identification of Russia as a threat may sound inexplicable. After all, according to the media narrative, isn't President Trump in bed with Putin? And the answer is conditionally no, although there are legitimate concerns about President Trump's approach to Russia. Let me explain. You don't have to be Clausewitz or Sun Tzu to understand that Russia is the primary threat to America's moral and practical vital interests in Europe. Russia has become increasingly authoritarian since the high point of Yeltsin's fragile but imperfect democracy that peaked in its pro-Western orientation during the 90s. Putin has put Russia on an increasingly autocratic path, and that has been reflected in a reassertion of Russia's regional and global ambitions. Russia spans 11 time zones. Russia has still devoted a considerable amount of its resources to the military, and there's Putin's state of mind. Let me give you the inflection point that should have ended all optimism about Putin's Russia, but it hasn't. In 2005, talking to his legislator, the Duma, and this is a public statement, Putin said this: the greatest tragedy of the 20th century, this is according to Putin, was the demise of the Soviet Union. This is stunning. This is the equivalent of Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, saying sometime next month, in May of 2020 to be precise, I'm depressed because it's the anniversary of the greatest tragedy of the 20th century from a German standpoint, the defeat of the Third Reich in World War II. The Soviet Union was an evil empire that killed 30 million of its own people and enslaved tens of millions more. The Gulag is the essence of communism. The fact that Putin thinks that the demise of the Soviet Union is a tragedy indicates that this is not a partner for peace that should be conciliated, but an adversary that needs to be deterred. Well, why do we have to deter Putin? Because in one ways, I want to draw a distinction between Putin's Russia and the Soviet Union. For all of Putin's malevolence, conniving, and dissimulation, Putin's Russia doesn't represent the same type of threat that the Soviet Union did, and therefore Trump is wise to devote his primary attention to the Indo-Pacific. Well, why not? First of all, Russia's a basket case. The GDP of the United States exceeds Russia by a factor of 10. The European members of NATO's GDP exceeds Russia by a factor of another 10. We're a part of NATO, meaning Russia has literally a 20-to-1 disadvantage in resources. And despite the Russian military buildup, the Russian military does not pose the type of threat that it did at the high point of the Cold War, when Ronald Reagan rightly called it the evil empire bent on lying, cheating, and stealing to impose world domination. Nevertheless, it is a grave threat because what Russia seeks to do by bluff, it has a declining economy. Demographically, Russians are disappearing. Unless Russia succeeds in subverting Ukraine's independence, there will be fewer than 100 million Russians by 2050. The average life expectancy of a Russian male is 58, the only place in the semi-developed world where it's gone down because of rampant alcoholism. The economy, except for the energy sector, which is now on the ropes, is the only productive aspect of the economy. Russians want to leave. What Putin wants to do is reverse this decline by expansion. And Ukraine is his first target. So why aren't we alert to Putin's threat? And why has President Trump, although he's gotten better at it, initially repeated the mistakes of his predecessors by thinking it was appropriate to reach out to Russia? Well, first of all, Trump's not the only one to do it. Bush 43 did it until the Russia's invasion of former Soviet Republic of Georgia disabused him of that notion. Obama not only pursued a reset, but refused to abandon it when the Russians essentially violated every optimistic assumption that the Obama administration had reaching out to Russia. One of the first things Obama did was cancel the deployment of missile defense in Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary, angering and demoralizing our allies. And the idea was that by doing that, we'd have a kinder, gentler Putin who would not only be a responsible citizen in Europe, but also in the Middle East. Obama invited Putin to rescue him when he backed down from his red line, thinking that Putin would temper the ambitions and the behavior of his clients Assad in Syria and the militant mullahs of Tehran. The opposite was the case. And then Putin invaded Crimea as part of a systematic strategy to subvert Ukraine's independence. And a lot of people, and initially Trump, reacted to the idea, well, why is Ukraine important? Isn't that a bridge too far? That type of logic is called, in international politics, realism. Realism has been one of the dominant paradigms for looking at international politics. It comes in many forms. The most dangerous form of realism that masquerades as being sophisticated is thinking that international relations is all about power, not about ideology, not about honor and interest. And the idea is that states calculate their interests by very, very precise calculations of power politics, irrespective of ideology and the nature of their political system. So here's the logic. Russia shares a border with China. China and Russia have been historic rivals. If China is our main enemy, so scholars like Neil Ferguson posit, why not align with Russia to contain China? Since Russia, by this logic, has an interest in constraining a powerful China, particularly China that is a country that has claims on Russian Siberia, where all the Russian resources are, and it's the only productive area of the Russian economy. And the reason is that unrealistic realism doesn't take into account ideology. Eventually, Russia and China may fall on one another, the way Hitler and Stalin did. In the meantime, however, Putin sees the West in general and the United States in particular as the #1 obstacle to his goal of reconstituting some version of a Russian empire in East Central Europe, to the detriment of European security, to the freedom of Eastern Europe in general, and to Ukraine in particular. We have the resources and the imperatives to stop that. Unlike China that confronts us with a formidable resource competitor, we are well capable, even devoting primary attention to East Asia, in containing Putin and keeping him in his box, including preserving an independent Ukraine aligned with the West, if we had the political will and the foresight and the correct assessment of Putin's goals in forming our policies toward Russia. All we need to do is have a neo-Reaganite strategy of deterrence, and Putin is denied outlets for expansion, and that put pressure on his corrupt government to reform or collapse. The only way Putin escapes his dilemma is Western weakness. Alas, until Trump, that's precisely what the West was doing, particularly Germany and particularly the Obama administration. And Trump's initial flirtations with Putin and the periodic revival of the idea, even by Mike Pompeo, recently reported by Walter Russell Mead in the Wall Street Journal, that we can make use of Russia to balance China is a danger. It is a Prozac to our overall interest and capability of keeping Putin in his box and the pressure on. Again, a saying attributed to Einstein, It's not, but the idea certainly applies here. The definition of insanity is to do the same thing again, expecting different results. Obama's reset failed miserably. Trump's initial reaching out to Russia has failed miserably, and he has provisionally moved to a much more vigilant strategy. Everything the Russians have done since 2008, it's not ambiguous. They view us as an enemy. There's the military buildup. There's their behavior in Syria. There's their enabling of Iran. There's the subversion of Ukraine's independence. There's the effort to undermine missile defense. There's the dissimulation about the coronavirus. And there's the manipulation of the American electoral process to delegitimize the American president, whoever he or she is. What people missed about 2016 was that Russia, in my view, did not care who won the election of 2016. Their goal, and it's chilling because they succeeded in this, was to delegitimate anybody who won. This is a country, therefore, that is trying to subvert the very institutions of freedom as we speak. There is not a glimmer of optimism about our relationship with Russia that justifies any reassertion of any reset. We have to treat Putin and China as an enemy, and any effort to conciliate Putin will demoralize our allies in Eastern Europe and demoralize Ukrainians fighting for freedom. Now, international politics is not sociable. So power matters, but so does principle. To be sure, there are times when, in extremis, you have to rely on the lesser evil to defeat the greater one. The paradigmatic example of that is having to rely on Stalin during the Second World War to defeat Hitler. Although had we followed Churchill's advice in the first place, we wouldn't have confronted that dilemma. Churchill said very shortly after the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, Churchill began making favorable references to the Soviet Union in the House of Commons, despite Churchill's long record, which he would revive as a vigilant anti-communist, rightly. And a reporter asked him, Prime Minister, what's going on? Churchill said, sir, in the predicament I'm in, I would have made a favorable reference to the devil if Hitler had invaded hell on this day in the House of Commons. So we can't avoid, in all circumstances, having to make a choice based on the ethic of the lesser evil. We can in this case. We have the resources and we have the interest. As Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski pointed out, Russia without Ukraine, Russia without 48 to 50 million Ukrainians, a territory as large as Spain, centrally located, Russia is not a major threat if Ukraine is integrated with the West. So we have a vital interest, leaving aside ethics, in preventing Russia from subverting Ukraine's independence, which I think President Trump belatedly, conditionally, and not always reliably, and we have to hold his feet to the fire on this one, has recognized. What's my evidence? Is it wishful thinking? Well, Trump has sent arms to Ukraine, his predecessor did not. President has increased American deployment in Eastern Europe and given a speech committing the United States not only to Europe's security, but emphasizing Poland's great contribution in a way his predecessor did not. President Trump has bolstered American military power in general, the opposite of what his predecessor has done. President Trump's energy strategy, which has achieved not only energy independence, but made us a superpower. As my former student who has a book on this subject, Energy, Todd Royal, wrote it as a capstone, has pointed out, Trump's strategy of energy independence has ravaged Russian energy companies and weakened them. In fact, one of the reasons the Russians are now trying to cut oil prices is to destroy the American fracking industry. Another example of Putin's implacable hostility. So we have an interest geopolitically in preventing Russia from dominating Ukraine. We have the resources. We also have a moral interest that we must not slight. One of the things that makes America great is when we can, we do not throw fellow decent democracies under the bus. That goes for Israel, that goes for Taiwan, that has behaved admirably in this corona crisis, a free market country that has had free elections, proving that Chinese can operate in freedom too if given the chance. And we have an obligation not to throw Ukraine under the bus, which reinforces our concrete interest. No people has suffered more from Russian tyranny than Ukraine. Stalin's Holodomor of the 1930s, the deliberate starvation of millions of Ukrainian peasants, is one of the great crimes of world history. And it would be something that, as Churchill said of appeasement at Munich, would get us neither peace nor honor if we were to abandon Ukraine based on a surface theory that we could use Russia to balance against China. That's the same type of flawed logic that Obama had, thinking that he could flip Iran, despite its virulently anti-American regime, into a partner for peace. We shouldn't do that. And although Trump has done much better than Obama on substance, and the trajectory has been on the positive side, that's not a ringing endorsement. It's like saying you're the best looking person in the physics department. This inclination of Trump periodically to express his admiration for strongmen, whether it's the Chinese dictator, whether it's the Turkish dictator, or whether it's Putin, is one of the features of President Trump's approach that I think legitimately causes concern, or should, not just among President Trump's enemies, but his friends. On balance, however, with his liabilities on this conceded, the substance of his policy has been very tough on Russia and conducive to American interests. What of, however, the rest of Europe? During the primary campaign of 2016, Trump said that NATO was no longer worth anything, and he doubted its worth even in its heyday. This is nonsense. And I think part of, or I'm hoping part of Trump's strategy is to use bravado as pressure to cajole NATO to do more. NATO is the most successful peacetime alliance in history. The original goal of NATO, as Lord Ismay put it, in 1949, the first commander of NATO, was to keep the Soviet Union out of Europe, to keep the Germans down, and to keep the Americans in. Now, let me rephrase that for the sensibilities of the 21st century. NATO is still valuable to keep the Russians out, the Germans committed to being good Europeans rather than making Europe German, and the United States remaining as the essential balancer. But there has to be an adjustment. One, we spend 3 times as much on defense proportionally as Germany does, despite Germany's great wealth. That's going to change. Many of our NATO allies act like spoiled children, particularly the Germans. They want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to be able to get the benefits of American protection, A, without paying for it, and B, without supporting the United States diplomatically in other regions. The Germans have undermined Trump, who has vigorously fought against this, to his credit, by building 2 pipelines, Nord Stream, that has increased German dependence on Putin, even though American energy independence gives the Germans a safer, more reliable alternative. German public opinion polls rank Trump a greater threat than Putin, just the way that in the 80s, German public opinion polls saw Gorbachev more benignly their menacer than Reagan, their defender and liberator. Angela Merkel has undermined the Trump administration's somewhat successful attempt to get the world to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Germany in particular, but France joining in, has also undermined or sought to undermine Trump in his dealings with Iran. What Trump is arguing is that NATO is important, but there has to be reciprocity in terms of burden sharing and not lockstep support, but at least the effort to contribute to rather than undermine America's diplomatic initiatives. And finally, President Trump has been proved prophetic that we are entering an age of sovereignty. How many more indications do we have to have that the European Union is on the ropes and perhaps should be? There's Brexit. There's the failure of the European Union to control its borders that precipitated Brexit in the first place. Look at Angela Merkel's hapless decision in 2015 on the refugee crisis that became a global crisis for democracy. Look at the European Union's bitter division and paralysis during the Corona crisis, where the Northern European states like Germany have left Italy and Southern Europe, not just on this issues, but many issues in the lurch. Trump has been prophetic in understanding that a European Union that is becoming less democratic, less effective, and more virulently anti-American as distinguished from NATO is something that we should no longer support, and also something that even if you wanted it, we have to be prepared for a world that is a post-European Union world. So what Trump has tried to do in Europe, contrary to the flamboyance of his rhetoric, is not to end NATO. On the contrary, his argument, which I think is a sound one, is unless you reform it, it will end. NATO's salvation and the purpose that it can serve for the United States utterly depends on greater burden sharing, diplomatically, economically, and militarily. American cooperation in Europe also depends on recognizing national sovereignty. Many people who have criticized Trump and Boris Johnson in Great Britain have posed a false choice. Beware of binary alternatives. According to the alarmist, if you're for Brexit, you're for going back to the nationalism of the 30s. And only the EU is the antidote for that, which is not NATO. It's a separate entity that's often anti-NATO. It's wrong. Go back to Margaret Thatcher's speech at Bruges in 1988, which revised Winston Churchill's original pro-American conception of European democracy based on fellow democracies retaining their sovereignty, committed to free trade, but not seeking a European superstate that's anti-American, unwieldy, unaccountable, and increasingly undemocratic. If you are for continuing the NATO alliance and the cooperation between the United States and Western Europe, which for all its problems has been one of the great accomplishments of American diplomacy after World War II, you can't stand pat. And for all of his flamboyance, President Trump understands that sometimes if you want to save something, you have to reform it. So the upshot is that despite my misgivings, which President Trump's past and his rhetoric and his propensities for having more admiration for strong men than he should fuels these doubts, President Trump has been reasonably tough and become tougher on Russia, which is in our interests ethically, morally, militarily, and politically. And on the issue of the European Union, and on the issue of international institutions generally, President Trump has been absolutely prophetic. Let me leave you with one observation to prove this. Last week, I emphasized that unlike Obama, Trump had a deep skepticism to international institutions. Well, it's a good week for him. The United Nations, in their unwisdom, decided to put two countries on the Human Rights Commission. China, a tyranny, and Venezuela, another tyranny. Set and match to Trump on that one. Thanks for listening, and I'm amenable to any questions you have.
Thanks so much, Dr. Kaufman. We do have some good questions coming in, and several of them do center on this criticism of the president as it regards Putin and the relationship with Putin. You have noted your own misgivings about that several times in this lecture, and you've also noted that it has been more of an evolution of sorts, your perception that it's been an evolution of change. But there is this record of President Trump criticizing our own intelligence community in appearing defense of President Putin. There was that set of back and forths as it related to Russian meddling in the 2016 election. I think something that we can all agree certainly did happen, but President Trump's reticence to actually agree with that assessment. Tell us a little bit then about, and maybe some of this is going back over some things that you've said already, but about some of your perception of why Trump has seemed to want to warm up to Putin in some ways at the expense of our own intelligence community and other experts on the subject.
That's a great question. And I think Trump's behavior on Putin has multiple sources for inspiring it, or his defiance of conventional wisdom. One is something that people would consider sophisticated if it came from anybody else but Trump. And that is to say the balance of power, Henry Kissinger idea that I call unrealistic realism, that says that despite our differences, we have a common interest in containing China, hence that transcends the immediate problems between us. So for reasons I explicated, I think that theory is wrong in general and dead wrong in this particular case, but that's one source of it. And Mike Pompeo revived that. And unlike Trump, Mike Pompeo, I think, is a fine Secretary of State. Talking to Walter Russell Mead, one of the finest commentators on foreign policy there is, and writing for the Wall Street Journal, as many books, Pompeo said that we may try to reach out to Russia again. So although I think there's a gravitational pull for a greater strategic and moral sanity toward Russia, this impulse to reach out to Russia is down, but it's not out, and I think people are reasonably concerned about it. Now, there's also some stuff, I think, specific to Trump's out-of-boroughs New York personality, some of what he says about Russia, and I think it's counterproductive in this case, is to taunt. And this is a case where I think Trump's personality undermines his good case. If, for example, he had said sensibly, yes, the Russians did try to meddle, but this entire Mueller investigation was a witch hunt, as William Barr soberly repeated today, our fine Attorney General, I think Trump would have a lot more credibility. This is an area where Trump, living by the sword, which often serves him well, this bravado, can sometimes come back to bite him. And I think there's also some of that. There's this unrealistic realism and this desire to stick something in the eye of his critics. But in this case, I think Trump's instincts on this serve his critics better than it serves Trump.
And so on that, we actually have another questioner who is quoting from your book, Dangerous Doctrine. And this is a reader. and this is about the case that you made against President Obama regarding the national security implications of accumulating a massive national debt. Obviously, this is something that has only continued under President Trump, but I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the criticism that I think is fair to say has been going on within the right, much less anywhere else, about the profligacy of this administration's spending policies and the possible impact on national security.
Well, one, that's a legitimate concern. This was also a legitimate concern under Reagan, although I think I agreed with Reagan's answer prudentially. That is to say, politically and economically, you have to grow your way out of something. There is no way politically that you're going to cut your way to prosperity. Look at the 1990s, when Reagan was criticized for essentially borrowing to bring the Soviet Union down. He promised tax cuts, national defense being restored in a balanced budget. It was like the old 1976 song, I want you, I love you, I need you. Well, 2 out of 3 isn't bad. And so faced with that choice and the trade-off, the reluctance of Congress to cut entitlement programs, Reagan decided on tax cuts and defense. And it brought the Soviet Union down and produced the peace dividend that did produce the balanced budget. I think there is a legitimate concern about debt, even more legitimate when you look at the terrifying implications of this bailout package. That It may be necessary. National debt, and not just national debt, but being dependent on unreliable places. Having China have your, hold your bonds. Having China manufacture your antibiotics. One of the reasons we've soft pedaled with Putin, and it's chilling, we depend on Russia for uranium. Why in the world is the country that crossed the nuclear threshold first beholden on an enemy like Putin for uranium? So I think the questioner is absolutely correct and the resolution is not going to be easy. The questioner is absolutely right to include not just the security of American industry, military security, but also fiscal security as part of the equation of what constitutes national security in the 21st century. So I think that's a very legitimate concern. Here's my response. If you're choosing between Trump and what his opponents are offering, Trump is the worst ever except for anybody else. So right now, at least, while I share the legitimate concern, and I think it should be an issue that we debate vigorously, as a practical matter, the alternatives to Trump right now, if that is your concern, if Joe Biden is that manifestation of the alternative, the Gang of Four, and Nancy Pelosi, Trump may be someone who needs improvement, but all the alternatives are worse. But that's not an entirely satisfactory answer. It's a very legitimate concern.
Let's just piggyback on that a second to talk at least about one area of the budget, and certainly something that the president claims that has a direct impact on national security, and that is spending in the military. Are you in agreement with the president regarding the decrease in budgetary allocations for the military under President Obama, and is there credit needed to be given for President Trump for increasing it? And maybe just to put a final point on it, was it necessary?
Yeah, absolutely necessary. As James Mattis pointed out, we had 8 years of strategic atrophy where the margin of American preponderance had dangerously eroded. Spending on defense is not the problem. Let me give you some data to put this into context. We're only spending 3.6% of the GDP on defense. This is freedom insurance under Trump. Obama was heading it below 3%. We were spending 3% on defense on the eve of Pearl Harbor, woefully unprepared for what was to come. Harry Truman spent 13% of the GDP on defense, Eisenhower 9.1, Kennedy 8.6, Reagan 6.6, Bush 4.5%. I agree with Hal Brand. We could easily spend 4 or 4.5%. Kennedy spent 52 cents out of every federal dollar on defense. Under Reagan, it was 29 cents of every dollar. Under Obama, it was only 13 cents of every dollar. A, we get a lot for defense, and B, proportionally what we're spending on defense is going way down. C, we have adversaries that are building prodigiously. D, we have global responsibilities. If you are looking for the main culprit in our deficits, it's not defense. It's the growth, it's the voracious growth of the entitlement and regulatory state. So even if defense disappeared tomorrow, and it would be a Hobbesian world, for freedom, life would be nasty, solitary, brutish, and short. But even hypothetically, if it wasn't, you'd still have a huge problem because the real money is in the entitlement state.
So we do have a question about China, and obviously you covered that in our first session. And just as a step back here in our last 5 minutes, Professor Kaufman, where are we heading over the next 2 weeks?
A couple of things. I am glad that the questioner has called us back to China, because again, this is one of the things that I credit Trump for immensely. China has been our #1 problem for a long time in the most important area, and few people have recognized it. So anything that focuses our attention on China and the threat, whether it's trade, the coronavirus, their predatory behavior in the East and South China Sea, their military buildup, what they're doing to their own people, how it impacts us or portends what they intend for us, anything that raises the alarm and causes us to do more toward China, value-based alliance system, India, building the military, economic security, moving production back to the, it's all good. For the next couple of weeks, we're going to soft pedal things because we still depend on Chinese antibiotics. We still depend on Chinese precious metal. So the time to pick a fight is not when the other side has maximum leverage. What we should be doing, and I think we were doing this anyway, is beginning the long overdue process of A, decoupling our economy with China's, and B, restoring the preponderance of military power necessary to deter what I'm going to call it the evil empire of the 21st century. And if that sounds like hyperbole, I'm happy to have a debate on that. If you look at China's behavior to its own people, look, there's an estimate by a study at Southampton University in Great Britain that if China had given us and the world notice in November and December, where they had all this information, we would have been spared 95% of the damage caused by the coronavirus. And the fact that this regime was deceptive, malevolent, and now is trying to exploit it and lying about it, if this were a single instance of Chinese behavior, it'd be bad enough. Unfortunately, this falls in a pattern rather than constituting an outlier. So again, for the short term, increase your powder, increase your leverage, but don't pick a fight until the situation is to your advantage. And I think that's what Trump is doing.
So we have one other question, and we can close with this. Again, I just want to let the students know, and again, thank you for your time. All of you, actually all of our registrants for this session will be sent a link to the video within 24 hours of this session, along with a couple of the links to both the books and maybe even a couple of the articles. I'm thinking about that Walter Russell Mead piece on Pompeo. We may want to, so I know the journal is sometimes behind a paywall, but at least we can send that along as well following the session. And we look forward to seeing you next Friday at this same time and place live from Malibu. So why don't we close with this, even if it extends a few minutes beyond. A question has come in about how much of Trump's foreign policy is actually coming from him and how much is coming from around him. Now, this could certainly be a question asked of any president, right? And certainly if we go back over the last maybe 4 or 5 presidents, maybe until George H.W. Bush, we haven't had someone who had real foreign policy experience stepping into the presidency, certainly not with Clinton or W. Bush or with Obama. You quoted from one of President Trump's early books going back 20 years ago, I think, that he already had his worldview pretty well set on China. Maybe we could close a little bit with how much do you think of President Trump's or the administration's foreign policy is really coming from a set of principles and worldviews that he's developed over time, and how much of this is either just off the cuff or just coming from other parts of the national security apparatus?
In looking at presidents historically, sophisticated people have always made the mistake that they're a creature of the advisors. This was the running interpretation of Eisenhower. Diaries proved otherwise. This was, Reagan was an amiable dunce, according to Haynes Johnson. Then critics had to revise that, Reagan in his own hand. If you go back to Trump's book, even if it's a product, not his writing, The America We Deserve, what he's doing on China is all there. What he's doing on trade is all there. And I went back to the book because originally when Trump was talking in the language of an isolationist, I was worried that he was reconnecting to the old Charles Lindbergh right that was not only isolationist, but had anti-Semitic overtones. Much to my pleasure, I also found in that very book, The America We Deserve, his account of taking on Pat Buchanan, who was that type of isolationist in the 90s, and arguing for the importance of our relationship with a decent democratic Israel, including in that book, moving the embassy to Jerusalem. So there is a lot of Trump's evolution that has been reinforced by advisors, but let me flip it over. No one lasts in the Trump administration, and there's been a lot of turnover, without fundamentally either being compatible with Trump or being able to convince him why what he said originally should be modified. And finally, I helped Richard Nixon write his final book. Not a Nixon person. Nixon told me, and he wrote, there was a lot of good cop, bad cop in Nixon. As Nixon would put it, I'd sound crazy. This is Nixon talking, so that Henry could be the reasonable one. And I think there is a method to some of Trump's madness, and there's some madness to his method. So the task is to figure out what the comparative rates are. But I think we would do, and I think it benefits Trump, we would be repeating a major mistake to think of Trump as a creature of his advisors. Look at his record. He's in charge. And I think people who think otherwise fundamentally underestimate him. And there are 15 other Republican candidates and Hillary Clinton littering the political field of those who have underestimated Donald Trump, who is in general, and whether you agree with him or not, even in foreign policy, maybe even more so, a formidable figure and a force to be taken seriously and a force to be reckoned with. I know that's not the conventional wisdom. I think the conventional wisdom's wrong.
Dr. Kaufman, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you who are joining us either live or will be watching this on video in the link that will be forthcoming. For all of us of faith, this is, we near the end of Holy Week. And so today being Good Friday for Christians and Easter on Sunday with Passover this past Wednesday, I want to wish all of you a blessed Holy Week, and please stay safe. And we look forward to seeing you next week for the next set of these short courses. Thanks so much for joining us. And again, we look forward to seeing you next week. God bless.